first ever session of Untitled Imaginary Society. So a few words about what imagination and Untitled may be about. We think that central in imagination is the ability to see that everyday life can indeed be different and is of our own making. So that the central social and economic institutions that make up our life can be different and they can be reimagined and reassembled. Or seeing the difference between what is and what could be or should be. Or perhaps imagination is the space before the problem and solution spaces in our thinking. Or maybe it's about this office that would normally be filled with, let's say, 60 to 200 people daily, and now it's just filled with these antiseptic hand rub bottles, not people. So perhaps the crisis we're in is opening the gates of imagination after a long period of cultural, social, economic orthodoxy. This is at least what we are hoping and sensing also from our own filter bubbles, at least. So this session is part of Untitled, the 10 years process of imagining and experimenting. Untitled is founded by an alliance of activists across the sectors, and our purpose is to collectively reimagine society and set the agenda for the most transformative experiments and execute them together. So welcome for everyone on Untitled's behalf. I'm one of the people, as Outi mentioned, working on that project. And Outi, perhaps you would like to go through the timetable and introduce.
True, I'm on mute. Welcome those who have joined after we started. Very, very welcome to the first ever meeting of Untitled Imaginary Society. And now, next there will be a talk. After that, we will send you to small rooms to have conversation on social imagination, then come back, ask you a question, and then close off together, and we'll finish in an hour and a half. Of course, if you need to leave earlier, you need to leave earlier, and we will share with you the recording of Geoff's talk. So next, I will give the floor to Geoff Mulgan, who is now a professor at the UCL, formerly known lately as the director of NESTA in the UK, and now has very recently, a few weeks ago, published a paper called Imaginary Crisis. And Geoff has been writing that paper this spring, and suddenly it is more timely than ever. And now those who have already read the paper, this is your great time of posing hard questions for Geoff. And those who haven't, this is a great time for you, because you will be introduced to the ideas in that foundational but yet open paper. Geoff, please.
Well, thank you all for joining this, and thank you to Demos Helsinki for giving me an excuse to think a little bit about where we might be heading. I've spent all my day today on the immediate crisis, as many of you will have done, around COVID. So this is partly therapeutic to think ahead. But also, as we're seeing around the world today, there was an interesting initiative from Andrew Cuomo in New York. People are beginning to say, let's use this crisis to solve some of the problems we had anyway, to accelerate, hopefully, social change for the better, and break free of some of the zombie orthodoxies which surround us. So what I'm going to do is share some of what's in the paper, but I'll do it in a much more visual way, partly so you don't have to look at my face, and partly so it's different from what's in the paper. And I hope this then is a spark, a prompt to create a much more expansive conversation. There's lots, I'm sure, that's wrong in the paper, lots that's missing, and I'm hoping all of you will help us to I thought I'd start with this picture, which I hope you can all see. This is a photograph from an extraordinary year of social imagination, 1848. It's a photograph of nearly 1 million people gathered in a park in London behind an organization called the Chartists, who had a series of demands about things like universal suffrage, nearly all of which happened, but they happened 70 years later. And it's just an example of a working class movement putting on in the public eye radical, transformative ideas, which looked perhaps completely utopian at the time, but nearly all were achieved. And this quote is quite a famous quote from Oscar Wilde at the end of that century, on the idea of a map of the world that doesn't include utopias, not even worth looking at, because our progress comes from the realization of utopias. And the reason I think for this project is a feeling that we've kind of lost that sense of possibility and imagination. This is one chart in the paper from Pew, looking at how people answer the question, do you expect your children to be better off than you? And in most of, much of the Western world, that confidence has disappeared. People expect the children, like the child we can hear now, someone might go on YouTube, you know, we don't expect them to be better off. It's different in different parts of the world. We have a very uneven pattern of pessimism and optimism, but the overall trend is striking. And I think one of the reasons, and again, the purpose behind Untitled, is the sense that many of the institutions which should be helping us to imagine the university, the political party, the think tank, our media, are really not doing that job. For different reasons, they've vacated perhaps this duty of helping a society to imagine its own future. So in the paper, I look at some of the different sources of kind of imagination, the landscapes, looking at the past. And I'll go through this very, very quickly, but there is, I think, a fascinating history of how our societies in the past tried to think ahead. The history of utopias, from Plato to Thomas More, to people like Edward Bellamy, you can see there, whose book was a huge bestseller in the late 19th century, offering all sorts of visions of a future sort of socialist America. There's a whole history of generative ideas, and on the right-hand side, you therefore see René Cassin and then Roosevelt, and who promoted the whole idea of universal human rights, a kind of crazy idea 200 years ago, but now, you know, embedded in our world in all sorts of ways and extended in all sorts of ways. And many people try to create prefigurative places. The top there, you see both a successful example from Robert Owen on the right, which was his New Lanark Co-op, which was one of the dawn of the cooperative movement. On the left, his attempt at New Harmony in the US, which was a complete disaster, and shows how difficult sometimes the job of imagination can be. And in the bottom, Auroville from India, an extraordinary place, which maybe some of you have been to. And there's a whole history of using urban design to spark the imagination, from Cabet's communities based on a utopian novel in France, to the creation of garden cities, the kibbutzes, and on the bottom right, places like Freiburg, trying to show through a reality what a zero carbon ecological a society could look and feel like. And there's a whole range of sources of imagination from the arts, from fiction, people like Ursula Le Guin, Marge Piercy, from games and world building tools, which help in film or in a game to help you imagine all the interactions of a society, and imaginative arts. Some of this is from the Neotopia program, which came in Korea, partly spun off a book I wrote, trying to use arts to explore futures of data, AI, etc. in society. And there's an interesting history of speculative social science. So the LSE in London was originally created with the idea that it should try and design a future society, not just analyze. You have people in Scandinavia like Hansi Freinachts, you know, trying to do the same. And I thought I'd just put in this quote from H.G. Wells, just partly because it is so much the opposite of what most social science thinks it's trying to do today. For him, 100 years ago, it was obvious that sociology was the description of an ideal society. It had a social or political purpose, wasn't just detached and analytic. And there's a weird role played also by things like great exhibitions. We were meant to be having Dubai 2020 later this year, which you can see on the bottom. The Shanghai Expo, Milan 5 years ago, showing new models of food, etc. These are places which try to crystallize imagination. There's a whole field of speculative design. Some good examples who I quote in the paper there. And although Finland, of course, is the great pioneer nation, here I emphasize New Zealand, which is where my family comes from. which in the 19th century was the first country to give all women the vote, pioneered the welfare state between the world wars, and last year had the first well-being budget, and is in a way, some countries take on the mantle of being exemplars, prefiguring what the rest of the world might be like in the future. So that's a very quick rattle through of some of the history of imagination, but I think it's a history worth recovering. And for some reason, Ursula Le Guin shows up again and again. In some ways, the novelists, I think, capture better this idea that it's through imagination that we achieve so much. And often, scientists, children know this, but often our decision makers forget this as they are perhaps captured by the tyranny of the immediate. There's then a whole section about tools, methods, which I'll only go through very, very briefly, but I'm quite struck how many of the exercise of imagination are in some ways quite simple. They apply these kind of creative tools like inversion, where you swap roles, or extending an existing idea to its logical conclusion, or adding things on to the school, the hospital. These are very useful tools which can help you break free from the bonds of perhaps the immediate reality and being trapped by orthodoxies. And I then try and look at what possibilities we might discover in the future. And there's a space which I hope Untitled can help us fill in, which is this kind of matrix of possibilities. On one axis, all the different fields which make up a society, from care for the elderly to democracy to media, energy, how we treat animals, the firm, and these kind of generative ideas like the circular economy, or deconstructing property rights, or automating decisions, which may wash their way through all of these different fields. And I hope part of our exercise of social imagination is to be quite concrete. What might be the things within these cells? What might happen if you really apply some of these ideas to new fields? And can you describe them in ways which can be interrogated to see if they make sense, to see if we want to live in a world which has those things? And then I'm just going to end with a few of the sort of issues which come up from the analysis. So one of them is to ask, what are actually the conditions for a really lively social imagination in Helsinki, Finland, Europe, in the world? And it obviously will include some of the things I described earlier, people creating utopias and fictions and games and prefigurative places and ambitious political programs. And I think we could try and explore whether there is some way of always imagining an ecosystem of imagination where there is an allocation of time and resources, engagement with the political leaders, people willing to make and shape the future in reality. It's crucial to have critics and audiences, people who can say this is good, this isn't any good, this is flaky, this is, and in a way that's what happens in all fields of creativity. You have milieu, which bring together the creativity, the critics, the audiences, and they interact to create an ecosystem. I think we've lost that around social imagination, and that's one of the reasons perhaps we have a problem. There's also, I think, an interesting question of the relationship of all of this to progress. And in the paper, I suggest one way of thinking about this, which is a sort of dialectical way of thinking about social imagination. That if you look in the past, there's always been some imagination which just sort of goes with the flow, just tries to go with the grain. A lot of the smart cities movement does that now. It's just sort of a bit uncritically enthusiastic about technology, let's say. And there's always been a strand of that. And it has a mirror, always, at least for the last 200 years, of people saying, let's sort of reject all of that and go back to living in villages, completely off-grid, almost reject the modern world. But I think nearly always the most powerful and useful social imaginary is in some ways synthetic. It tries to both go with the grain and against the grain, to absorb and challenge. And I think that's an approach we probably need now, as we're surrounded by a whole array of new tools around AI, zero carbon, etc. How can we go with some of the energy of that sort of progressive force in our world, but in ways which also challenge it and bend it in different directions? And then the final, perhaps the hardest, but on some ways most intriguing question is how we link social imagination to imagination of a more advanced or more developed consciousness. And of course, this is how societies evolve. They evolve interior as well as exterior. They evolve in how people think and see and feel. And ideally towards much more expansive, much more generous, much more open ways of seeing the perspectives of others, the perspective of long time, the perspective of the ecology, and so on. And there are many, many theories attempting to get to grips with this. There's Lawrence Kohlberg's ideas from a long time ago on moral stages of development. There's the now very familiar sort of spiral dynamics ideas, which I first got involved with about 25 years ago. I'm a bit skeptical of them, but at least it's an attempt to create a framework for thinking about how organizations or societies or consciousness evolves. And there's the slightly weird things like hierarchical complexity models, which try to create a whole structure for how our consciousness evolves. And I'm not sure where we take all of that, but it has to be part of this story. It's a story not just of policies and institutions, it has to also be a story of our consciousness as human beings. So a few sort of final sort of questions from me. In a way, the key issue for all of us and Untitled in the midst of this very real, not imaginary crisis of COVID is, what can we do next? How do we create those kind of ecosystems, the institutions, the spaces, the skills, the habits to do this better? And perhaps, as happened in the late 19th century, to create visions of the future, which don't just appeal to a small group, very highly educated people in cities, the kind of, I call it the singularity university problem, which is the ultra elite version of imagination. How do we make those much more expansive and inclusive of other voices, other interests, and so on? And how do we make them influential? Again, as happened in these past periods of history where the social imaginary feeds into political programs, feeds into practice, and they in turn refresh, replenish, and regenerate the social imagination. So that's enough from me. I'm going to stop showing any pictures. And I hope that at least has sparked off some violent disagreement or something anyway.
Dom, do we have questions for Geoff in the chat?
Yes, we do. One from how can we not recreate unequitable imaginings and futures? Why don't we draw examples of possible futures from people like Octavia Butler, where the imagining of people of colour, women, Indigenous people are centred? So is there other forms of society which are doing new imaginings? I imagine that question is about.
Well, so two or three maybe obvious things to say. One is that history of social imagination is also a history of bad imagination or of dangerous or imaginations or ideas which turned out to be horribly destructive. And often I think the over-defined ones where a group believed they had a way of completely reordering a society, at its extreme takes you to Pol Pot and Cambodia and, killing 1 million people just like that. So we have to be critical of imagination. There are actually great traditions of social imagination which are truly global. Most people probably have heard of Plato. Far fewer people know about Al-Farabi's work, imagining the model city. This is back, nearly 1,000 years ago. Or the Indian traditions dating back to Kautilya, which were very much traditions of imagination. So it's vital to break out of the Western mindset. And in science fiction, there are very, very dynamic sci-fi movements in Africa, in China. In a way, the whole center of gravity of imagination, I think, has moved away from the Western world. And part of what we probably need to do is to tap into the energy coming from those parts of the world, which, as I showed in the Pew survey, may be feeling a bit more optimistic than the embattled, perhaps declining parts of North America and Europe who think everything's stacked against them.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for a couple more. What is the relationship between social imagination and knowledge or evidence to inform policy decisions? Can social imagination be seen as not being rigorous and therefore not useful for incoming policy decisions? So I guess it's about the process and why imaginations aren't rated as highly as kind of policy.
Well, I guess one of the things I'm suggesting, I think this is very much also a Demos Helsinki view, is that the most useful social imagination is not too prescriptive. It's sort of generative. It opens up an idea, a way of thinking. And hopefully that is then followed up by the makers who turn it into real life experiments, practical things which can be done in reality. And at that point, you do need to be empirical, rigorous, and measure. And then those things may feed back into imagination. What you don't want is a perfect blueprint produced by a bunch of intellectuals, which then is imposed on the society. That's the disaster. So we need a new sort of hybrid synthesis of radical, truly imaginative imagination, but then a willingness for every element to be tried out in reality and to learn from practice and get that feedback. And often what went wrong, again, in past periods was an over-intellectualized view of how imagination should work, which they usually didn't work very well. And Robert Owens is a great example right at the beginning of this history. His practical stuff in New Lanark in Scotland, which he did, he had to run factories and sell stuff and employ people, that actually worked pretty well. When he went too theoretical and abstract, and tried to create in New Harmony in America a sort of perfect vision of the society, it crumbled almost immediately. And there'll be many, many examples of that going wrong. So I think the Imagineers need the humility to realize that most of their greatest value will come from people taking their ideas, but doing different things with their ideas than they had imagined in the first place.
Great. I think we have time for one more. What is your view or views on collective versus individual social imagination? For example, are we following someone's vision or are we creating something collectively? And how is that then done?
I'm not sure how many visions are truly individual. And usually, even if something from a distance looks like one person's incredibly creative imagination, when you look closely, they're part of a milieu or a set or a sort of mood where many people are having similar ideas at the same times. And again, not to be sort of too academic about this, if you look at the history of utopias, nearly always you find there were lots of them being written at the same time by different people. Even though we may only remember one of them. So I think the very idea of a social imagination which is purely individual is probably misleading. I think these things arise out of the sort of conversation we're, I hope, about to have now, where people come together, they criticize, they share, they feed off each other. If you go and sit on a desert island or in isolation from COVID and you switch off all your stuff for 3 months, I don't think you're going to have a very useful social imagination. But, someone may prove me wrong on that.
Oh, do you think we have time for one more or should we move on?
You're in charge, Dom.
Okay. Well, I think you wrapped up quite early, so we've probably got time for one more. Should we start from local action rather than ideas? So do ideas come from action or does action come from ideas?
Well, it's got to be both. You don't know what to do unless, we as humans, we have these things called brains and they're able to think and imagine. Children do it very naturally. And again, as I point out in the paper, any child is completely able to imagine a sort of fictional situation in play from the age of 2 or 3 onwards. And then as we grow up, we're able then to draw on ideas to create our own new fictions. And that then turns into local action. If you're setting up a local food scheme, or at the moment, as I'm sure many of you are involved in local care and support schemes in your communities, often that will be drawing on things you've seen elsewhere, or on some way to use, Facebook or whatever it may be. Almost none of it will be completely original. It's a kind of bricolage. It's a hybrid of elements. But then when you aggregate lots and lots of local experiments around food or energy or transport or care, they then feed back into perhaps a much more comprehensive vision of how a society could be run differently. And that's what's so fascinating about this moment in the crisis, is we're seeing a whole host of things being created as emergency experiments, everything from universal basic incomes through to platform-based circles of support for the elderly, through to new uses of data, on which I've just published something today, in fact, which could become permanent new settlements, parts of permanent new social contracts. And they are both local and national, well, they're all of those things at the same time, feeding each other. And that's what makes this whole topic so interesting. It's quite hard to see often which came first, the idea or the execution.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful question there. Can we imagine a new being? I think I'll throw that out to the whole group to answer.
All right. Thank you. There is very wonderful questions. So I think there is no lack of things to talk about in the smaller group. So let's move there so that everybody can raise their voices. So actually now we can have a half an hour to talk. Can Jenny able me to share the screen?